Good morning. We are here to talk about diversity in Canada's charitable and not-for-profit sector. And my guests today are three individuals who represent the majority of the sector in Canada. Cathy Taylor, who is the CEO of and founder of the Ontario Not-for-Profit Network, engages with 10,000 not-for-profits in Ontario. Peter Dinsdale, the CEO and president of the YMCA with 1,700 locations across the country, and Bruce MacDonald, the CEO of Reimagining Canada, with 30,000 engagements with people across the country. So as you say, we are going to be talking to the three people who have depth and scale in this country when it comes to charities and not-for-profits. Okay, let's start off with the first question to Reimagining Canada. Bruce, why do you think diversity in leadership is important for the charitable sector, especially when the charitable sector is the sector that does good and, you know, its spirit and its values are all around public good? So why do we need to overlay this issue of diversity on it?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, thanks for the opportunity and taking the time to, to discuss this critical topic. I mean, I think for us, there's a couple of things that we would think about as part of this discussion. One is, I think it's critically important that organizations in our country that seek to do good for their communities actually reflect the communities that they serve. And so not just from those who are the beneficiaries of service, but those who are the donors, those who are the volunteers, and those who offer the leadership to the organization are deeply embedded in the organizations and the communities from which they come. And I think the second part is that we're witnessing a shift, and we seek to propel this shift from, in a sense, an approach of community good where one group that's more privileged helps another, sort of a more colonial mindset, to one where solutions to community issues are co-created through rich and meaningful partnerships.
And that can only happen when everyone's at the table as opposed to just a few. I get that entirely. Cathy, your organization was very deeply involved in working with StatsCan on designing the survey. You have an interest, I know, in evidence and data, but beyond that, why did you make that investment of time in developing the survey with Stats Canada?
Oh, such a great question, Senator. We really believe that boards play a critical role in the work of nonprofits and charities. As nonprofits, by their very definition, are community-led and community-driven. And if they want to be community-governed, then we need to see that reflection in their makeup. We know that data has been limited, and so we have been advocating for years, along with our partners at the table, for better data around the nonprofit and charitable sector in Canada. And this was a huge opportunity to work with StatsCan to even though it was a crowdsourced survey, it was a start to help us paint a picture of where the sector was, what the opportunities were, where we were falling short, frankly. And we also wanted to make sure the survey really included nonprofits and registered charities, grassroots organizations, and that could be part of a sector-wide initiative to really start pushing the boundaries on the information we know and where we can go with that information.
So thank you for your help on that. We know the results are in, Peter, and here's what they tell us. In short, there's a significant diversity deficit in the boardrooms of Canada's charitable and not-for-profit organizations. So only 14% of the respondents identified as being immigrants to Canada, whereas the share of the population is 25%. 11% identified as belonging to visible minority groups, as opposed to, again, the population share. 8% identified as LGBTQ, 6% as persons with disability, and only 3% identified as First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. What is your first gut visceral response to those numbers?
Well, they're actually better than I thought they would be, even though they're not representative of Canada or the communities we serve. And I think the second issue for me is I think they're probably overstated, even though they're as low as they are, because of the methodology. The crowdsourcing the crowdsourced survey, I sent it out to all my wives. I'm sure Cathy sent it out to her network. Bruce sent it out to his, and we all have, and as well as you, Senator. And so I think we're getting people that are inclined to want to know the answer to this, that are inclined to want to work on this, that are more inclined to take action. So I think this is the best case scenario. I think there's a large part of the charitable nonprofit sector they're not reaching. That's why, I'm such a big advocate of what you called for, is changing things like the T3010, the corporate filings that we yearly, every charity has to talk about and provide a response to how they're doing in this area, so we can measure and we can improve. So my first response is those numbers were better than I thought, but I really thought about it. I think it's because of the methodology, and we're kind of preaching to the choir maybe in some respects.
So you like me are asking for standardized, annualized gathering of evidence so we can understand where the trend line is going. So this next question is to all three of you, and we'll do it one at a time. It is probably the most important question I will have for you. The study also found that roughly 30% of the respondents found that their organizations had a diversity policy, 47% did not. We also found a correlationship between those who had a diversity policy, therefore had more diverse members. Again, we can't make too much of this data because it's crowdsourced, but it gives you an inkling. Mm-hmm. So the question to each of you is, because you all, your membership-based organizations, why do so few organizations have diversity policies? And how are you going to help them get there? Bruce, I think you're ready with an answer.
I wish I had an answer. It's a great question, and I think though I really did find that there was this interesting, at least initial glimmer of hope between those organizations that had written policies were doing a bit better. So what it kind of spoke to me was this idea of intentionality. And I think it goes back to some of the reasons why organizations don't have diversity policies. I don't know that until there's been this seismic shift in the way we're thinking about anti-racism and anti-oppression issues in our society, that organizations had been intentionally sitting down to think about, how are we going to change the systems by which our boards are constructed? That would include things like policies and potentially targets to against which we can measure ourselves. And I think just like any goal, you write it down, you have a higher preponderance of actually achieving that goal. It seems the initial findings are similar for organizations who create policies. Their actions seem to map to those policies. And I think part of the role of organizations like ours is to encourage through the instruments that we have the time for organizations to take that thought and put those policies in place.
Okay. Peter, what do you think about the lack of diversity policies in the sector?
For me, there's a parallel. When I first came to YMCA Canada, we were doing our strategic plan, and I brought along reconciliation as an important piece of work that we should do as YMCAs across the country. There is a great thirst to do that work. There's also a great concern about how to approach it, not wanting to make a mistake, not knowing what the first step is. I think it's the same thing for these diversity policies. I think people know intellectually it's an important thing to do. They don't know how to make that first step. And I think a lot like Bruce has talked about, what we're doing at YMCA Canada is we recently signed on to the Black North Initiative, where we commit to diversity targets throughout organizations, including our board. We held a webinar for all YMCAs in the country to inform them and encourage them to sign as well. And we developed a committee to help develop policies and procedures to walk our YMCAs through that process. Some of our YMCA leaders, which are very insightful, said, we have enough architects, we need more plumbers. Tell us how to do it. I'm going to sit down at my desk and I'm going to do this. What is the first thing I do? And is that kind of tangible, crunchy stuff that we're trying to bring to them.
Mm-hmm.
Cathy, over to you.
Yeah, I fundamentally believe, and we hear this every day, that nonprofits are facing so many competing priorities, and they're subject to so many forms of accountability. Think about health and safety, employment standards, accessibility, Elections Canada advocacy rules, add in fundraising, financial management, all of those pieces. And most of them feel overstretched or under-resourced, particularly in times of COVID. And so when we think about that and the fact that half of the nonprofit sector does not have paid staff, these organizations often have limited capacity to build really robust governance systems and documents. And that's not at all to excuse them from this, but to understand that we need to do, as Peter and Bruce have said, we need to take a more strategic and helpful, like really practical perspective to help them along the way. I think the intentionality is there. I think, you know, what we're hearing is that they just haven't prioritized this because A, somebody hasn't asked them to, and B, they just don't have the tools and resources to do it the right way. And so that's where I think our roles can play a difference. And there are going to be a small group of organizations that actually still don't understand the value in diversifying their boards. That's a separate issue. And I think, you know, one that we still need to continue to share different examples and different narratives about.
So Bruce, you used the word target, and I'm interested in that. Some people think of targets as quotas and get very frightened that it's some kind of, you know, top-down affirmative action policy, whereas target is just a target is a goal. But do you think, let me speak about the members of Imagine Canada, do you think your members are ready for targets?
Well, I'll be honest with you, I don't really know the answer. I can maybe only speak to the journey that we're going through at Imagine Canada itself. And so we've been working on examining our practices at a staff and board level over the last sort of 4 months around really everything from hiring to onboarding to career development to board composition. And it has been strongly suggested to us that having targets by which we can measure progress as opposed to being viewed as quotas is more of the mindset that we should be playing here. And that, to Peter's point, like, we got to start somewhere. We have to change the current behavior if we're going to see a real difference. And being able to go back and then say, you know what, we did set a goal, and it may not be that we have a goal there forever, but to change the DNA of the way we behave and act, we're going to need measurable targets with which we can then have conversations as to whether we achieve them or we didn't achieve them and why not.
Okay. So I could carry this conversation on forever, but I want to be respectful of everyone's time. And so here's our last $1 million question. And I want all of you to think about it and answer it. What's the path forward? I can see 3. We could have legislation. The government legislates federally regulated businesses to disclose demographics on an annual level and actually legislates them to develop and table diversity plans. So that's legislation. The second could be regulation, which is in which the CRA amends its form, T30 or some other similar form, so that they get that information annually, but they don't get the diversity plans. They just get the information. And the third would frankly be something different, that the government says, we believe in diversity in Canada, and therefore we are going to fund the charitable not-for-profit sector to pull itself up by the socks and do the right thing. Which one would you pick? Who's smiling the most? Cathy, let's go with you.
Oh, great. Thanks, Senator. You know, absolutely there's a role for governments here. I think that data collection is the #1 role. Making it mandatory for reporting requirements in the T3010 or the T1044 for nonprofits is the first step. For sure, it's easy, well, maybe not easy, but certainly not complex. And so that having organizations report on that is going to be a first step for them to recognize how important it is. You know, I'm a little leery about legislation that requires diversity plans, because what you'll get is people just whipping stuff off just to meet the legislative requirements and perhaps not doing the real work that they should do. So I think that, you know, regulation and legislation may be helpful to encourage the sector to take diversity seriously, but it really behooves those of us that are intermediaries and umbrella organizations and federated models to walk alongside the sector and really help them with tools, resources, best practices. You know, we're doing some work on reimagining governance and what that looks like for the future. So I would start with governments as data collection and also as funders they can, all funders, not just government funders, but foundations and private funders can also make diversity a priority in how they fund. And those are the two levers that I would suggest starting with.
Okay, so data and funding. Peter?
Yeah, again, I think of our journey on this. We're just about to survey all of our YMCAs to get a sense of what our existing board diversity is, so we can set our internal targets to get it to reflect the communities they serve. And so part of it will be the collection of data and then, improving it year after year, like I think the government should. So I'm a big supporter of regulations, in particular the T3010 and the nonprofit forms being adapted to collect it so we can do better. I think there's maybe an option as well where we have, like in America under George Bush, changed federal legislation so companies can only apply for government grants if they had gender diversity on their board and certain senior representatives. I think those same diversity targets could be utilized to access some funding, so it could be more of a carrot than a stick per se. I think ultimately the other role the federal government can play is convener and collector of information. Where are the best practices? If we legitimately want to take those next steps but don't know who to go to or who's doing it well, is there a repository? Is there a department? Is there a group that can pull that together and help share and support the sector? Maybe Bruce's organization could take that on behalf of us all. But anyway, that kind of coordination and support, I think, is critical as well.
Okay, last word to Bruce.
Well, I'm not sure I have that much new to add, but I will pick up on the theme of data. I mean, our belief is that effective public policy is based on good data so that we can make wise decisions. I think the government has a wonderful and ideal role to help the sector in the creation and provision of that information and data with which we can then design policy instruments and solutions that make the most sense. And I also think that they have the ability to play a role in nudging behavior, whether it's convening or regulation or funding for organizations to play that convening role instead of government doing it itself. There is a role. And I think that it all starts with knowing where we're at and knowing where we want to go.
That was a fascinating conversation. And I take one thing away from all of you is the baseline. We have to have the data. We have to have the evidence. And then from the evidence, good things shall come.